To our success, brothers!
To our success!
They found the body in a dumpster behind a fish market in Incheon. No wallet, no phone, no face. But the strange part? The man everyone assumed was dead had placed that body there himself. His name was Park Jae-won, and for 12 years, he ran the most feared criminal network in South Korea. A man who smiled at weddings and ordered executions before the dessert was served. But one morning, he disappeared. And the people who loved him, feared him, and trusted him, all of them started dying. So who was Park Jae-won really? And who did he betray first, his enemies, or the people who called him family? There is a photograph, black and white, taken in 1998 at a small restaurant in the Mapo district of Seoul. In the photo, 6 men sit around a table covered in bottles of soju and half-eaten plates of samgyeopsal. They're laughing. All of them. Big, full, real laughs. The kind you can't fake. The man in the center is tall for a Korean man, nearly 6 feet. His jaw is sharp, his eyes are dark and still, even mid-laugh. He's wearing a plain black suit, no tie, the top button open. He looks like he owns the room. Because he does. That man is Park Jae-won. And every single person at that table, every single one, will be dead within 15 years. Except him. Now, the police who eventually dug into Park's life would describe him as, quote, the most dangerous man we never charged. He was not a brutal enforcer. He was not a loud gangster with gold chains and a short temper. He was something much harder to catch. He was a thinker, a planner, a man who understood that the most effective weapon in a criminal empire is patience. Park Jae-won was born in 1966 in Busan, South Korea's second-largest city, a port town, a place where money moved fast and the line between legal and illegal was more of a suggestion than a rule. His father was a dock foreman. His mother worked in a canning factory. They were not poor, exactly, but they were never comfortable. And Jae-won watched his father come home every night smelling of salt water and other men's decisions. He made a promise to himself, very early, he would never be the man who followed orders. By his late teens, Jae-won was already orbiting the edges of organized crime in Busan. Not as a thug, he was too smart for that. He ran numbers for a mid-level boss named Cho Sung-il. He collected debts, not with violence but with a quiet, unsettling kind of calm that made people uncomfortable in a way that fists never could. He would sit across from men who owed money, pour them a cup of tea, and simply look at them until they paid. It worked every time. By the time he was 24, he had moved to Seoul. He brought 2 things with him, a reputation for competence and a mind that never stopped calculating. Seoul, in the early 90s, was electric. The economy was booming. The city was changing faster than maps could be redrawn. And in the chaos of rapid growth, criminal organizations found fertile ground. The Yakuza had connections. Chinese triads had influence in the port districts. And Korean organized crime, known loosely as the Kangpai, was fighting for its own slice of everything. Jae-won walked into this world with his eyes open. He found a mentor, an older boss named Lee Dae-ho, who ran a network of gambling houses and loan operations out of a building in Yeongdeungpo. Lee was old school, smart but traditional. He saw in Jae-won something he hadn't seen in a long time, ambition that was disciplined. So he took him in, taught him the structure, the etiquette, the unspoken laws. And Jae-won learned everything. Then he used everything he learned to eventually take everything from the man who taught him. But we'll get to that. By 1995, Park Jae-won was no longer someone's student. He had his own operation. Small at first, a protection network in 3 districts, a loan business, and a side arrangement with a string of karaoke bars that served as both entertainment venues and private meeting rooms for men who needed to speak without being overheard. The smart thing, the thing that separated him from every other mid-level criminal trying to climb, was that Jae-won was almost entirely invisible. He never appeared in public with the trappings of power. No flashy cars. No expensive watches. He drove a 7-year-old Hyundai. He lived in a modest apartment. His clothes were clean but unremarkable. But he was building. quietly, methodically, like a man laying the foundation of a skyscraper one brick at a time when everyone else was looking at the skyline. His real genius was relationships. Jae-won understood something that most criminals never grasp. Real power doesn't come from fear alone. Fear makes people obey, but it also makes them look for exits. What makes people truly loyal, what chains them to you in a way that's almost impossible to break, is obligation. Gratitude. The feeling that you, and only you, truly understand them. And so Jae-won invested in people. He paid for a young gangster's mother's surgery. He helped a corrupt detective's son get out of a gambling debt before it became a scandal. He arranged for the wife of a business owner, a man whose permits he needed, to receive an anonymous envelope every month while her husband was in prison. He never asked for anything immediately in return. He simply waited. And when the time came, he never had to ask twice. By the late 90s, Jae-won's network had quietly expanded into 4 cities. He had relationships with politicians, junior ones at first, but they rose. He had police contacts at every level. He had businessmen who laundered money through import companies and construction fronts. And he had a small, extremely loyal inner circle of 6 men who had been with him since Busan. Those 6 men were his family. Not in the sentimental sense, in the actual sense. He ate with them. He celebrated their children's birthdays. He was godfather to 3 of their kids. He knew the name of every member of their extended families. He knew their fears, their secrets, their weaknesses. He knew who drank too much. He knew who had affairs. He knew who had doubts. He knew everything. And he never used any of it against them. At least, not until he decided it was time. Here is something about Park Jae-won that investigators would later piece together, detail by detail, interview by interview. He had been planning his exit from almost the very beginning. Not an exit from crime, that was never part of the plan. An exit from exposure, from accountability, from being the name at the top of the structure. Because the man at the top of a criminal empire has a problem. Everyone beneath him knows his name. Everyone above him, police, prosecutors, politicians, wants to bring him down. The position of power is also the position of maximum vulnerability. Jae-won had watched enough bosses go to prison to understand this. He had watched Lee Dae-ho, his old mentor, get arrested in 1997 during a crackdown, convicted, and sentenced to 9 years. He had watched 3 other bosses he respected make the same mistake. They built kingdoms and then sat on the throne in plain sight. He decided he would never do that. So while everyone around him understood that he was the source of power, the man all decisions ultimately flowed through, he was constructing, in parallel, a second identity. A ghost self. A version of Park Jae-won that had no criminal record, no known associates, no paper trail. His name in this second life was different. His face would eventually be different. But his mind, his method, that never changed. And no one in his inner circle knew any of this. Not one of the 6 men at that restaurant table. Not even the closest of them, a man named Han Sung-joon, who had been his right hand since 1991 and who genuinely believed, that he and Jae-won would grow old together. In the spring of 2003, something changed. A prosecutor named Yoon Mi-rae was appointed to lead a new anti-organized crime task force in Seoul. She was 39 years old, methodical, and unlike many of her predecessors, genuinely incorruptible. She had turned down 2 significant bribes already, and when those offers were made, she had quietly noted every detail and filed them away for later use. Jae-won became aware of her within weeks of her appointment. He had a source inside the prosecutor's office, a senior clerk named Kim who had been on his payroll for 6 years. Kim told him that Yoon's team had already identified 17 of his front companies and was preparing a financial investigation. For most men in his position, this would have triggered a specific kind of response. Eliminate the threat, bribe the prosecutor, destroy the evidence. It was the expected playbook. Jae-won did none of those things. Instead, he did something no one anticipated. He let them build a case. He spent the next 8 months carefully separating himself from the empire he had built. Not destroying it, just rearranging its architecture so that the visible top layer was no longer him. He promoted a man named Baek Dong-soo, loyal, capable, and completely devoted to Jae-won, to an apparent position of leadership. He funneled the most visible assets, the ones Yoon's team was tracking, into Baek's name. Then he waited. In October 2003, Yoon's task force moved. They arrested Baek Dong-soo and 8 other men in coordinated raids across Seoul and Incheon. They seized cars, accounts, properties. They held press conferences. Prosecutor Yoon stood in front of cameras and announced that the leadership of one of Seoul's most dangerous criminal networks had been dismantled. She was wrong.
She just didn't know it yet.
Baek Dong-soo, sitting in an interrogation room, believed with his whole heart that Jae-won would get him out. That was the deal, the unspoken deal that Jae-won had never articulated but had always implied. We protect each other. We are family. Jae-won did not get him out. Baek served 6 years. This was the first betrayal, and it was not the last. With the heat temporarily redirected toward Baek and the dismantled front layer, Jae-won began the next phase of his plan. He quietly relocated the actual operational core of his network to a new structure, one built on different names, different fronts, different geographic zones. He moved significant cash reserves into overseas accounts. He began the process of acquiring a new identity through a contact in Japan who specialized in exactly that kind of transaction. And he kept meeting with his inner circle, Han Sung-joon, the others. Every week, the same dinners, the same conversations, the same warmth. They grieved together over Baek's arrest. They raised glasses to him. Jae-won said, with what appeared to be genuine emotion, that Baek would be taken care of, that his family would want for nothing. It was true. Baek's family received money every month. Jae-won was nothing if not meticulous about the performance of loyalty, even when the thing itself was gone. Because here's the thing about Park Jae-won that makes him different from a simple con man or a cold sociopath. He was not indifferent to the people around him. He felt things. He genuinely liked Han Sung-joon. He had real affection for the men he was preparing to abandon. That made what he was doing worse, in a way, not better, because he chose it anyway. In August of 2005, Park Jae-won disappeared. He went to dinner with Han Sung-joon on a Tuesday night. They ate well. They talked about nothing important, a football match, a television show, the birth of one of Han's grandchildren. Jae-won hugged him at the end of the night. A real hug, long enough that Han almost felt something was wrong. He pushed the feeling aside. The next morning, Jae-won was gone. No note, no call. His apartment was empty, not ransacked, not abandoned in panic, but carefully cleared, like someone who had been packing slowly for months and had simply finished. The inner circle spent 3 weeks assuming he had been killed. They looked for a body. They put out inquiries carefully through intermediaries. They found nothing. No body. No witnesses. No trail. Then, slowly, the truth started to emerge. Not all at once. That would have been easier to process. It came in pieces. A banker in Macau who mentioned, offhandedly, that a client matching Jae-won's description had liquidated a significant account in June. A front company in Busan that was found to have been systematically stripped of assets going back to 2001. Evidence, small and scattered, that Jae-won had not been murdered or arrested, but had simply walked away. With their money, with their secrets, with everything. The aftermath was brutal. Without Jae-won's careful, invisible control, the organization began to fracture. Old loyalties snapped. Men who had worked together for years turned on each other, each suspecting the others of being in on the betrayal. 2 men from the inner circle were killed within 6 months of Jae-won's disappearance, targeted by rivals who sensed the weakness and moved in. Han Sung-joon survived.
But barely.
He was arrested in 2007 on charges that had been building for years. Charges that, investigators later confirmed, were only possible because the financial records that sealed his prosecution had been anonymously provided to the prosecutor's office. Park Jae-won had provided them.
Why?
That is the question that Han Sung-joon reportedly asked every single day of his prison sentence. Not, how could he? Not, what did I do wrong? But simply, why? Why go to the effort of destroying them when disappearing was already enough? The answer, pieced together years later by a journalist named Cho Hyejin, who wrote the most thorough account of Jae-won's life ever published, was both simple and terrible. Jae-won was not destroying them out of cruelty. He was doing it out of strategy. A living criminal organization, suddenly without its leader, is dangerous. It becomes unpredictable. It might, in desperation, do things that generate attention. That attention might circle back to the man who built it. By dismantling it, by handing the pieces to the prosecutors, Jae-won was cauterizing the wound, eliminating the thread that might eventually lead back to him. Every betrayal was a firebreak. The man who had prided himself on never burning anyone without reason, he had a reason. He always had a reason. It was just that the reason was always, ultimately, himself. Park Jae-won was located, tentatively, unconfirmably, in 2011. A South Korean intelligence analyst named Park Soo-bin, working with Interpol on a separate money laundering case, came across a name in the financial records of a small import company in the Philippines. The name was different. The face in the company's registration documents was different, thinner, older, with a beard that changed the whole geometry of the face. But the pattern was the same. The way the company was structured, the way the money moved. The same quiet, methodical architecture that had defined Jae-won's entire criminal career. Park Soo-bin flagged it, submitted a report, recommended further investigation. The report sat in a filing system for 4 years before anyone acted on it. By then, the man was gone again. Prosecutor Yoon Mi-rae, the woman who had dismantled Jae-won's front organization back in 2003, not knowing that the real architect had already moved on, learned about Park Soo-bin's report in 2015. She had retired from the prosecutor's office by then, but she was working as a legal consultant for an NGO focused on financial crime. She read the report and felt something cold move through her. She had stood in front of those cameras in 2003 and said the network was dismantled. She had believed it. He had arranged for her to believe it. He had given her the victory she wanted, on a schedule that suited him, with pieces that were already designed to be expendable. She had been used, too, just more cleanly than the others. The last confirmed sighting of a man believed to be Park Jae-won was in 2019 in a coastal city in Vietnam. A former South Korean detective named Oh Young-woo, on a personal trip, reported seeing a man at an outdoor restaurant who matched Jae-won's physical profile. The man was eating alone. He was dressed simply, the same aesthetic as always, unremarkable. He looked, Oh said, completely at peace. Oh took a photograph on his phone. By the time he raised it, the man had stood, left money on the table, and walked into a crowd. The photograph shows an empty chair, a half-eaten meal, a glass of water. Nothing else. Han Sung-joon was released from prison in 2014. He was 61 years old, in poor health, and had outlived most of the people he had spent his life working alongside. He gave a single interview, years later, to journalist Cho Hyejin. When she asked him what he would say to Jae-won if he could, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I would ask him if there was ever a moment, one moment, when he thought about not doing it. When he almost stayed.
He paused again.
I think there was. I think he almost stayed. And I think he made himself leave anyway. That's the part one can't forgive. Not that he left. That he chose to. Maybe Han was right. Maybe somewhere in Park Jae-won, in whatever city he now calls home, under whatever name he has constructed for himself, there is a man who still remembers the weight of that hug on a Tuesday night in August. A man who occasionally thinks about the photograph, 6 friends, laughing at a table, alive. Or maybe not. He ordered. Not the empire he built. But the question that no one can answer. Was there anything there to betray? Or was it all, from the very beginning, a performance? We don't know. We may never know. The chair is empty. The meal is finished. And somewhere in the world, a man who no longer exists is already planning his next move. Pause 1.5 seconds after. And every single person at that table will be dead within 15 years. Except him. Lower tone and slow pacing. The description of Baek Dong-soo sitting in the interrogation room. Slight crack in voice or a long pause during Han Sung-joon's final quote. Deliver the final 3 lines slowly. one sentence at a time, with silence between each. The story uses suspense loops every 60 to 90 seconds. Each section ends with an unanswered question that is only resolved 2 or 3 segments later.